Thanks everyone for joining this next edition of 30 Minutes with a Hacker. This is Jade Whitty. I'm with the security group here at Tech Data, and with me today is Brett Scott and Josh Harp and Daniel Seth, who are three ethical hackers who are in the trenches every day and work with us here at Tech Data and are sharing their insights. We've kind of got a little bit of a different format that we're kicking off here from a go-forward basis. We've actually brought in Lewis Needham, who is the Senior VP for ATEC Group. And ATEC is one of our stronger security partners who services companies in the Albany, New York, and surrounding areas. So I want to say thank you, Lewis, for being on the call. And we're definitely going to want to kind of tap into some of your experience and what you're seeing out there in the market as you're dealing with customers. So today's topic it's around the idea that we are deploying, let's say, some state-of-the-art tool, and you're wondering sometimes, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? You know, you may deploy it, you may put it in place and test it, but then at times you're wondering, is this thing actually protecting our company? So we want to dive into this topic a little bit more and look at that, because hackers a lot of times will know that certain things may have been missed when a tool was deployed. Certain parameters were not put in place, and so they will look for those types of vulnerabilities. And so that's a lot of the dialogue that we want to have today. I wanted to kick it over to Lewis first. Share a little bit about this topic from what you're seeing as you meet with your customers out there in the market space. So Lewis, why don't you kick it off here?
Great. Well, hey, thanks for having me again. Yeah, great topic. In meeting with customers, going way back when everybody wanted a single pane of glass to manage their environments, same as today, but there are so many different security products out there, all operating a little bit differently, all having a kind of a different approach. So to learn them all is very difficult. So when we're talking to customers, we're trying to get them the mindset of future thinking, not only the architecture and what business problems it's solving, but how are they going to manage it and make sure that it's doing everything it should be doing in the future. There's a lot of points to this. One of the main ones, I think, is to make sure, that you've got that plan and you use that methodology to think now and going forward, and to make sure you have the right resources, the subject matter expert, if you will, to ensure that they understand what the tool should be doing, how to then test it using other tools to make sure that you're getting the results expected. And then if you don't have the option of having a separate compliance or audit department, to make sure you're building in somebody or some team that's going to be reviewing the configurations and change, because changes, as we know, isn't always good, to make sure that the tools are being configured and updated and tweaked as need be. There's a lot to it. From what we're seeing is the alerts. A lot of information out there. AI is helping, but if you can't provide relevant, actionable items to your team, they'll get overwhelmed with the white noise. And so proper tuning and understanding what the information supplied is key to making their time useful and preventing anything nefarious from happening.
Sounds good. Brett, do you have any comment on that, like any insights on what he's saying, or any follow-up question?
Well, starting with what you said, the first thing that is important to remember is the bad guys are checking your network and your configurations, and because of that, they should not be the only ones that are doing that. You should be doing that. One of the things that's kind of the unspoken secret of cybersecurity is 80% of security devices are misconfigured so poorly that they actually report something that they say they've done, but in fact or in reality they have not done. So the only way you would be able to know that those things been properly configured and not actually doing it is you'd have to do additional testing. In other words, you can't take the device's word for it having done what it said it did. You would have to do an assessment of that, and then using data and the methodology for assessing that data, be able to validate whether or not it is in fact doing what you think it's doing.
And there's a really relevant point there in that when the security tools are deployed into an environment and an adversary has gotten in, or you've had a potential breach or an incident or an event transpire, whatever you title X thing to be, most people try to safeguard themselves from 0 days, but the ways and methods adversaries typically get in is through misconfiguration categorized vulnerabilities. So you can have two different types of vulnerability sets: vulnerabilities that are based upon 0 days or known disclosures within the software being just broken, so bad programming practices, or an administrator taking shortcuts in the deployment of a tool or in the deployment of an application. So you have misconfiguration at the core to what leads to organizations ending up getting compromised.
And it's vastly more efficient to take advantage of misconfigurations than it is to use the sizzle of a 0 day.
Right.
0 days are expensive, they're difficult, whereas it's meat and stock to simply take advantage of misconfigured devices.
Yes, plus you're spending a lot of time on those 0 days. If there's a proof of concept code out there, trying to get that proof of concept code to work, because 9 times out of 10, it's not going to work. You're going to have to fizzle with it. It's easier just to go through and find misconfigurations or errors in the base code, like Josh said, to get into the system and to, basically bypass it.
And even beyond that, right? So getting to the white noise that Lewis talked about earlier, and making sure that your security tools are tuned properly and squawking at the right things. What about when your security tools aren't squawking anymore? So most people will take into consideration that there's something ambiently happening in the network. And so it's that networking team's fault to go, tasked to go troubleshoot it. Or it's like the NIC has failed. We're receiving all these packets in our environment and there's a spike within bandwidth usage. It must be the network card, right? So they will indicate that there are certain issues in the environment that aren't really happening because they're not used to the fact that one of the tactics used and employed by adversaries through the life cycle of their hacks, so to speak, is actually the disabling of security tools when they've breached the perimeter, because that helps to further embed their hack. Or as we've talked about in other sessions, the fact that they've been in your environment 6 months and have just been chilling there, getting to know you, and then all of a sudden beyond that 6 months, you start to say, why do I have this weird guest in my house?
It's really important, the point that Josh just made. Installing the stuff doesn't necessarily mean that the stuff stays there. And so I've observed our team doing several times. They'll get a toehold somewhere on one of the systems, and then they will begin shutting down things like endpoint security and other security mechanisms. And so most organizations do not even check to see if the things that they installed are still running. And as a direct result, if they uninstall your software, it doesn't matter that you had it in the first place. And so you need to put in place practices that would allow you to detect when something's been shut down, because there is a really good indication that there's malicious activity going on.
Yes, and if that uninstallation process has triggered an alarm in a SIM, and that event has been escalated, that the way somebody sees it just doesn't pass it off as a bad NIC card or a software misconfiguration, or oops, just rebooted.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important too, during that tuning phase that was talked about earlier, and ensuring that your devices are talking and things are configured appropriately, you may need to change your alert levels for endpoints and if the software is actually talking back. Because how are you going to know if this thing's on if you just tune it out, right? I'm pretty sure Lewis and his customers would say, well, we would rather know that there is an issue when it's not an issue than finding out there was an issue and it really is the issue or the indicator that something more has happened in the environment.
Lewis, do you have any more thoughts on that? Because I know you had a little bit more maybe you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, I mean, all great points, and it's a challenge, but I think some of it's just the awareness and education of the customer to be thinking differently than they have in the past. It's not just implementing a solution, but again, it's this constant monitoring and managing it. We deploy some tools that have that audit capability built in, where, for example, reference firmware, if anything changes or is out of whack with a certain, compliancy, you'll be alerted. But what we're seeing is, kind of what do you do with all this information? So if you look at skill sets of, level 1, 2, 3 engineering, sometimes the right people aren't looking at the right information. And that is a challenge. So when you can at least minimize how many things, that won't be distraction, they can focus on the meat of the issue, which in turn is difficult, right? We all know that. Now, some of the tools we'll do is a weekly vulnerability test to test for some of that stuff. Maybe somebody made it, again, a lot of the things that happen are human error. So we'll run some tools that might come up and find out that, see if the SIM or your SOC tool is picking up on what's happening, or it could be a nefarious attack. I don't know what organization feels they have everything mapped out, but I do know, in talking to some of the CIOs, the scared look on their face when you say you've invested in all these tools and technology. Do you feel comfortable that it's all working? Back to the original question, and the answer I think often is no. So then how do we become more involved in the management and administration of those?
Yeah,
and I think it's something our industry has started to recognize, that there is that difficulty in all of it. And I think the answer that has kind of come up out of the weeds for addressing the issue is attack simulations. Offensive engineers working with defensive engineers, the CISO, and everyone who is vested, everyone that's vested in the security of an organization comes together and assesses where they're at, from policy to procedure to technology. It's the collaboration between a functional test and a more tabletop-based theory test, where you're actually putting into practice the things that you've always thought were working because you've paid X amount of dollars for it. You had that consultant come on and you're like, yeah, it is fully deployed and it's working. But I think that hits home on ensuring that every engineer in the life cycle of either detection response, right, is aware and trained to knowing what's going on.
Yes, and with those tests, you make sure that in the process of doing those tests, the people involved in it aren't just concerned with getting a passing score, but also securing their environment, securing their business, and making that business future-proof to hacks, not to hacks, but just to be able to at least detect, mitigate, and recover from those hacks.
And that's because in the life cycle of everything assessments or everything test-wise, you take a vulnerability scan, for example. If you run a vulnerability scan in someone's environment, more often than not, they want to know everything that's wrong, and then they want you to benchmark them against the rest of the crowd and say, okay, yeah, we have all these vulnerabilities, but how does this compare to somebody else who's in our similar vertical? When we approach security from a pass or fail versus a strengths and weaknesses, where if I've identified what my strengths are, I know I can pour more time and effort into what I've identified as my weaknesses, then you get to a point of evolution, right? You're starting to move beyond what's held you back before and just continuing to invest in what strengths.
This is also an opportunity to identify areas of opportunity for orchestration. So, there is a cybersecurity skills gap. That's something we're trying to help solve with the Tech Data Cyber Range. But by the same token, organizations for years, maybe even decades, will not have the necessary talent to overcome their problems. And this is where doing these live, actual assessments of the security model and your response mechanisms, an adversarial view of your network is an incredibly valuable resource, which what outputs from that are not only your strengths and weaknesses, the SWOT, but also what are the low-hanging items that we could look to orchestration to help us solve. Mm-hmm. So for example, if somebody's shutting down my endpoint security, maybe there's an orchestration rule that says, well, turn it back on. And so that would give you the alert, but you would also have something that instantaneously responds and begins the remediation process. You're not going to discover those opportunities intuitively or with some other mechanism. You really need an adversarial exercise to help walk you through the logistics of a real cyber incident, but parsed and moved sequentially through time so that you can evaluate every step of the process instead of responding and trying to learn while you're responding to a crisis.
Great point. Lewis, anything you want to add to that? I know that we've talked a little bit about the importance of the subject matter experts and having things mapped out, in your organization, knowing what steps you're going to take. How are you guys approaching it?
Yeah, and I think that's, the main issue where, you buy the new shiny technology tool, and if you don't know what the buttons and gadgets do, how are you going to configure it properly? So a lot of times, organizations like ours help implement, two solutions from version X dot whatever to the new version. Having an organization learn that tweaking, tuning themselves when they have to do it once every 2 years, 3 years doesn't make sense. So bringing in the right resources, I think, is incredibly important, and they can help identify some of those gaps. And when you do some testing on it and the results, they ask the questions: why is this coming up? What does this mean? So definitely, subject matter experts are key. I'm not techie at all. You wouldn't want me implementing any tools, but having on the other side somebody saying, does this meet our needs, and who's going to be responsible for those audits, I think is sometimes left, kind of off the list of things to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies will sometimes want to hire those resources internally to have that expertise, and are looking at cost justifying, using a third party. But the challenge with that is it's so difficult to audit your own system. So it's imperative that you're outsourcing that component to someone that's looking at it from a totally different perspective to get that objective view. And you're not just having them do the check boxes, but actually doing what Josh was saying earlier about really understanding where those gaps are, if that's truly what you're after. So I think that's important.
Well, and we're pivoting more into a collaboration between internal IT security and external third-party security providers and contractors, because it is important that you get an external view of what's going inside of your environment, but it's just as important that you're taking your own internal view of what's going on, and you're doing a comparative analysis of what is it that I've seen and I've categorized as needing to be, it can become an issue for us and we need to solve now, and what is it that someone else who's not really familiar with my environment but spends time familiarizing themselves with it thinks is the prioritization that I need to take and the issues I need to fix. And so when they work together in the sense of, I'm going to have some people inside of my organization that know, right? And I'm going to work with people outside of my organization that know as well. That's where we are all at a point of bringing each other to a higher cybersecurity standard and evolving beyond the silo of, this is mine, I know it all, I'm going to control it all, I know what's important for me, and I don't want anyone to touch my sand, right? That is open up your sandbox and let everybody play in it so that you can, from a trust-based perspective, work together to a higher maturity standard.
And of course, a lot of folks, especially in cybersecurity, have an overly simplistic view of cybersecurity products. So when you look at it from a purely business perspective, when someone buys a new product, they assume it is additive to their security strategy. And that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes it might actually diminish your cybersecurity capability, but you're not going to know that until you do those assessments. And so from a business perspective, for those who are watching the bottom line, that means that when you're doing these assessments, you might actually find areas of opportunity to reduce your overall costs because you no longer need some of these other systems because they are essentially nullified through other combinations in your strategy. So you have both a business reason as well as a cybersecurity reason to perform these assessments.
And the business reason is a direct impact. I know Daniel and I have probably found on multiple assessments where people have overlapping tools, two things that do the same thing, and they are shelling out thousands of dollars for both tools. And the reason for that is they thought in changing what they had in their environment or pivoting to a new tool, but also keeping the other, maybe with that overlap, they would still maintain a secure perspective. And then someone just forgot about the other tool, but it comes in. And so finance just cuts the check because it's an IT budget and it goes out, right? So they're having overlap in multiple tools doing multiple of the same things instead of identifying different security appliances and applications and tools that do that one thing good, right? In cybersecurity, there's always the topic of jack of all trades, master of none. And if we take that into consideration around appliances and tools and applications, you'll start to realize, yeah, there's many different security vendors with a lot of the stuff in their portfolio, but if you start to look at what they're doing some things really well, whereas they function together well with others. So although they have all the things, you may want to use them for one, use somebody else for another. And that's what's about diversifying what's in your environment as well.
Which speaks to defense in depth, which is a very good strategy.
Yes. And putting tools in place that instead of I want the shiny box and the shiny light toy in my environment just because I can and finance will approve it, putting tools in place and putting procedures in place with those tools to effectively manage your environment and manage your environment securely.
So I want to pivot just a little bit in the time remaining. We don't have a lot, but you guys are you're ethical hackers, you're penetration testers, you're helping find those gaps. So how are you guys looking at it whenever you're going into an environment and you're looking to penetrate that environment? You're looking for the tools. What are the steps that you're taking to try and identify where the holes and the gaps are, the common missteps that people have when they're configuring them?
It's an evaluation initially of the environment itself. So I don't always begin with just what tools are in the environment. Once a box is compromised, you can already begin to assume the typical controls that are going to be there. So when you've known that on the endpoint they've probably got antivirus, anti-malware, or an EDR solution, right? Mapping that out and seeing if it's running in its process tree is a good indicator of what to start to remove from the environment next. Going into the aspect that Lewis mentioned earlier, a lot of people with the noise of just cybersecurity and different devices squawking can permit for you as the offensive attacker to hide into that noise. So you have network teams that will proxy certain ports and certain traffic going outside of the environment, but a whole slew of other stuff they don't begin to proxy. Again, because from an elimination of noise perspective. So it begins to get into a cat and mouse type of game. But that's where it comes down to the common measure of, am I watching and listening for whether or not my security tools are phoning home or communicating back to me? When I'm using an EDR solution and I have a managed platform for it and it says the agent has gone offline, do I just say, oh, maybe someone's powered it off the desktop so the agent's offline and we'll check it back in again later? Or do I say, well, there are correlating events before this that may give an indicator that that agent is offline because of something else? So that's where all of that alert prioritization comes into play and recognizing what may be important and what might not be.
What about putting in tools to be able to detect like OWASP top 10, MITRE attacks, stuff like that, that kind of framework, and putting detection mechanisms in place? Because some people, especially us, will use that framework as a baseline to see what you guys can detect or what you can't detect.
Yeah, so from a defensive perspective, there are certain vendors out there who have started to take into consideration that the tool needs to match up against different the TTPs, ultimately the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and that in parallel in the parallel of everything that an adversary does, there's going to be certain hooks and ladders that they cross within a Windows operating system to ultimately get their end goal. Yeah. It hasn't changed since the beginning of Windows, and it's not really necessarily going to change now. So they're starting to take into consideration from a deep learning perspective those measures that need to be applied. But to this day, I've not been able to effectively see a tool respond to a TTP or to a specific attack framework in an appropriate way. They're starting to encounter it and they're starting to make leaps and bounds in doing it, but But I think what it comes down to is the training of the engineers from the 1 through 3 that we talked about earlier, that they would be able to say, oh, this disabling of security tools, that maps to MITRE's attack framework, and I can recognize where they might be next in their flow of things. So I think it's more so training the people, looking at the alerts and looking at the alarms as they come through. It's having an IR team. It's having somebody who might be familiar with threat hunting and how that works in action, and they having the familiarity with the frameworks, because those alerts and those alarms are the first indicators to something more.
Daniel, how would you describe, just because there's people on this call of all different levels, right, of technical capabilities. How would you briefly describe the MITRE's framework, attack framework?
It's a playbook, really. In simplistic form, it's a playbook. Okay, I come across a client that I'm trying to get into. Okay, he's got this vulnerability. Okay, I can either do A or B, A, B, or C. Okay, I move that A, B, or C. I can do D, E, or F. Okay, that's essentially just a playbook for somebody like me whenever I go in. That's what I will use initially to see what I can get into to get, a foothold on a system and to get privilege access. If that playbook doesn't work, well, I'll move over to something else more customized.
Right. Okay.
So getting back to what Josh was saying, a very, very important point there. What he was speaking to is the fact that it is the combination of technology and people. Neither one is sufficient to handle the cyber problem, but if you bring the two together competently, you have a solution. And the siren song of AI and machine learning and things like that all sound great, but ultimately, I think we're a few decades away before they will even enter the space of competition between technology and well-trained people as a replacement. So it's a very good point.
Well, technology is going to always lean upon us as crutches, right? Because we're the ones who are training it. We're the ones feeding it the information. We're the one giving it its algorithm for it to determine what it's going to do next, right? That in its simplest form is all of what we're doing. So in the same way we lean upon technology to give us a solution, technology is going to lean upon us as well, because you can only train it so far. You can only give it its a rule set so far. You can only let it out into the world and let it figure things out for itself and on its own until it tries to check back in and be like, hey, am I doing this right?
Yeah, good point.
Well, I know that we're kind of coming up on the 30 minutes to wrap this up. Lewis, do you have anything else you want to add, or are you good?
No, I think I'm good. I think just one thought that I'm hearing more of is the frameworks. ITIL, for example, even are coming up more and more. There was big around discussions when people were building out their service desk and help desks. But I think it's coming back to making sure that people communicate the same way, they define things the same way. What's an issue? What's a task? What's a problem? So that when something does happen, it's not foreign what they're talking about. Little things like that seem to be coming up more and more, and seem to help give a little bit of a process and structure to then map some of these other topics that you guys have been discussing.
Great point. Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone for your time. We'll be sending this recording out to all of our partners and getting this out on a monthly basis. And the new format will be, we'll have different partners that are strong in the security space join us for these calls and give us their insights and tips. And so, Lewis, we really appreciate you being on this call, and thanks for everyone that participated. And we'll see you next month on 30 Minutes with a Hacker.